Alright, the next video we're going to do is going to start to talk about the brain. The videos before now have just been about the neurons and the separations of the nervous system, but now we're going to put all that together and talk about how does those neurons actually make up the brain and what are the parts of the brain. So we're going to title these just basic brain notes. And clearly there's a lot to the brain, and we could go into a whole semester worth of information about the brain, but we are just going to do the most basic information about the brain. Yesterday we talked about how the structural unit of the nervous system is called the neuron, and that is the nervous system cell. That's the cells that make up the nervous system, just like we have epithelial cells that make up epithelial tissue, or we have muscle cells that make up muscle tissue. And there are about 86 billion neurons that make up the brain. And no, I'm not going to ask you that number, but I just want you to think about how structure is going to lead to the function. There's a ton of neurons that's going to make up that brain tissue. It's just a cell, and when we layer cells on top of one another, we will get tissue. And 86 billion neurons are found in the brain. The brain weighs about 3 pounds. If you were to take it out and weigh it, about 3 pounds on average. If it weighs less, it doesn't mean you're not as smart. It's just on average around 3 pounds. And the brain can be split into 4 parts. And those 4 parts are the cerebral hemispheres, the diencephalon, the brain stem, and the cerebellum. We're going to label this on the next video. Okay. Now, if I just take the information about the cerebral hemispheres, I'm not going to go into too much detail about the other 3, but I am going to expand more on the cerebral hemispheres. If I just take that information, I can look and see that cerebral is referring to the brain. Hemi means half, and sphere is spherical or circular. There are 2 cerebral hemispheres of the brain. So I'm just going to make some side notes down here about those cerebral hemispheres. There are 2. If I am collectively talking about both of them, we call it the cerebrum. We have a right and a left cerebral hemisphere, but together they are called the cerebrum. Easy to get those mixed up because cerebral kind of looks like cerebrum. There are about 4 lobes in each hemisphere. And they are named for the bones that are on top of them. So if you remember back to the skeletal unit, your forehead bone is the frontal bone. Then underneath that would be the frontal lobe. On the side, you have your parietal bones. Underneath that are the parietal lobes of the brain. So it's going to be easy to memorize it if you can remember the skeletal system unit as well. Okay, within the cerebrum, so within the brain, the whole brain, both of the cerebral hemispheres together, you have ridges or bumps and you have grooves. And they each have a name. So there are ridges or bumps I like bumps instead of ridges better, but I'm going to call them bumps and grooves. There are ridges or bumps, raised areas on the brain, and they are called gyri or gyri. I've heard them pronounced both ways. Gyri would be plural, and if it is just one bump, it's called a gyrus. And there are grooves called sulci or a sulcus for one. Now, if there is a deep groove where the tissue of a sulcus goes deeper into the brain, that is called a fissure. Let me underline the important words there. And they're kind of like a deep groove in the brain. There's one really important fissure, and it is called the longitudinal fissure. Longitudinal. And it will run down your head. If you were to split your head into a right and left half, it'll run down your head, down your brain, and split your brain into right and left hemispheres. It's kind of where we get the saying, you're right-brained or you're left-brained. That's coming from the longitudinal fissure because that's how the brain is split into right and left parts. So this separates the brain into right and left halves. Okay, and there's going to be other fissures that I'm going to give you names for, and that's going to split the brain into lobes. So the longitudinal fissure is not the only one. It's going to be the main one that splits the brain into right and left. There will be other fissures that will separate the brain into temporal lobe, occipital lobe, frontal lobe, parietal lobe, and all those important lobes that we're going to learn in just a second. Okay, each cerebral hemisphere has 3 regions. And the first one is called the cortex, and that's going to be the outermost part of the brain. It's going to be what you see whenever you see if you were to take the brain out, or when we do the brain dissection, what you're looking at is the cortex, and it's the outermost region or outermost part. And it is going to be gray matter, and I'm going to explain what that is in just a second. Underneath the cortex, you have the internal area, and it's going to be white matter. And then you will also have something called basal nuclei, and it is gray matter within white matter. We're going to have a picture of this in a second on the next video. But the cortex will be gray, and then we will have white underneath that. And sometimes that gray matter will actually go down into the white matter, and that is called basal nuclei. Now, what's the difference between white and gray? If something is called white matter of the brain, that means that it is myelinated, meaning that it is covered in myelin. And myelin, we talked about it yesterday on the with Schwann cells and oligodendrocytes. But myelin is a fatty tissue or fatty material in the nervous system that is used for insulation and it will increase the speed of impulse transmission. So when an impulse has to travel from a nerve to the brain, and then from the brain down a nerve to a muscle, for example, then it's going to have to travel pretty fast. Whenever I touch the hot oven, like I mentioned yesterday, you need to have that impulse to travel really fast so that you can get your hand away from it and you won't damage your skin. That impulse can travel faster when the tissue is myelinated. If it's unmyelinated, it just travels a little bit slower and it's not covered in this fatty tissue, this white matter. In general, white matter is myelinated and gray matter is unmyelinated. That's just generally speaking. So the cortex is not myelinated. The internal area of the brain is. And then the basal nuclei, which is just regions of that gray matter that extend into the white matter. White's myelinated, gray's unmyelinated. If you know anybody that has multiple sclerosis or MS, what's happening in that disease is the myelination of the nervous tissue is breaking down. And that myelin is degrading, and so the impulses cannot travel as fast as they need to or as they once did. Okay. All right, you're going to need to take out your pictures of the brain for the next video. So you'll need this picture here and this picture. And there's also another picture of the brain that looks like this. If I were you, I would get, I think I counted 9 colors, 8 or 9. And we're just going to outline some parts of the brain so you can understand the lobes. Okay, so go get 8 or 9 colors and get ready for the next video.